Well, we're delighted to have Pamela Bowers here with us today. I said it's kind of appropriate that for the first time ever, we've had to move out of that building, and the subject is trauma. And also, Pamela said, I don't have any handouts, I just need a PowerPoint. And we said, of course, we'll set it up for you. And then, of course, we don't have a PowerPoint in this room. She said, well, it's really just to remind me of what I'm talking about. And I said, thank heaven you brought your computer rather than a stick, because if you brought a stick, that really wouldn't help. Well, Pamela works a lot with, as a therapist, with people who have been traumatized, and she also teaches a class at Washington Community College that also is about.
Yeah, just a minor correction to that. I teach a class at Madonna University in Livonia.
University. Okay.
That's where I teach.
All right. And I think I even sent it out wrong, maybe when I talked about what you did. All right.
That's fine.
Well, anyway, we're delighted to have you here. And if you would like to get a copy of her PowerPoint, we'd be glad to send it to you. Just make sure that when you signed in, you put your email address there if we don't have it. Okay, thanks so much.
So, trying to think of where I can start. What I'd like to do is tell you in as short a time as I can what we know about trauma, where it comes from, how it manifests, what it means to us in the world, and then at the end, there'll be lots of opportunities for you to ask any kind of questions, discuss anything that you're interested in, how it affects you in your business as a mediator. I'm not a mediator, I'm a psychotherapist. I see a lot of trauma. It would be impossible to be a psychotherapist without encountering people who've been traumatized. So we've known about trauma. By the way, I also like to do it informally, so please do feel free to pipe up or talk if you've got a question or something. We've known about trauma for a long time, and there are some people who write about how trauma has been written about since Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the experience. It goes back that far. Shakespeare wrote about it, Henry IV. There's references to trauma. More recently, Civil War, it was called Soldier's Heart, I think. World War I, it kind of morphed into, I don't know, combat stress or something like that. Shell shock, I think it was in World War I. Then combat stress. It wasn't until the Vietnam War in the 60s, 70s that we really started studying it, though, and coming to really understand what it means to be traumatized. What was happening is that during the Vietnam era, the soldiers were coming back, and everybody was noticing, people who were encountering the soldiers, that there was a very discrete set of symptoms that kind of across the board, certain soldiers at least, had the same set of symptoms. And this was at a time that the feminist movement was also beginning. And people were noticing that women, sexual assault victims, for instance, had the same set grouping of symptoms that the war veterans were having. And so they put it all together, and they came up with what they formally labeled as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That was first put into the mental health jargon, the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and mental health professionals use. It was 1980 when it first appeared. So there's been a lot of research during that time and since on what trauma does. It is a pervasive kind of, people who are traumatized lose their capacity to cope in normal ways. It affects thinking, self-regulation, emotional reactivity, kind of all the domains that we think of as making us uniquely human. One of the things about trauma is that it is, lots of things, but it is pervasive. We know that now. We used to think, okay, this is just war victims, or this is just sexual assault victims. It is a pervasive kind of problem in our society worldwide. I have some stats here. I can't put them up for obvious reasons, but so the overall prevalence of trauma in the population, and it depends on what study you're looking at. It can be anywhere from 1 to 12% of the population. It really just varies widely. But 1%, even that, is a lot of people in this country. 12% is even more. What happened to my computer? Maybe it's not going to work either.
It got out of
The
range.
change.
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure.
Before you go too much further, would you mind telling us what you're sort of presuming that we all know the effects of trauma?
I'm not presuming anything. I'm going to talk to you about that as I go along.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the class I teach actually at Madonna on the psychology of trauma, it's taught to a wide variety of students, but it is, including social work and psychology students, but it is a required part of the curriculum for students in the emergency management program, because emergency managers and first responders, a lot of first responders are in the emergency management program, encounter a lot of trauma. And so you don't need any kind of background in psychology or social work or anything. This is really very basic.
So the symptoms are something you're going to come to later?
I will, absolutely. So interestingly enough, though, just in talking, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Do nurses take this course you're teaching?
Some do.
Okay.
It's not a required part of it, but nurses certainly come in contact with a lot of traumatized people too. 2%, get this one, of postpartum women after birth suffer from traumatic stress disorder. You wouldn't think that would happen, 2%. It's 2%. 18% of firefighters, 48% of female sexual assault victims, about half. Prisoners of war, 67% statistically. Prisoners, anywhere up to 85% of the prison population. Highly.
No, is this due to their experience in prison or before?
Before. Development, before. Trauma surgeons, ER nurses, you just asked the question. 15 to 18% of surgeons in the ER and nurses suffer from, as a consequence, we think, of
their work
of
in the ER.
exposure,
Wow.
of exposure to over and over and over again. So you can see that it is pretty much across the board in so many different walks of life. Something that's noteworthy as well is that about 2 to 4 times as many women as men suffer from PTSD. Why would you think that's the case? PTSD. Go ahead.
Women are more detail-oriented in life in general, therefore they might be more detailed as far as emotions, and so then they're affected more.
Okay,
because
so they feel deeper. Okay.
They feel deeper, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I think they're more often in caregiving situations.
Caregiving. Okay. Other thoughts about why women more than men?
I think women in general may tend to just share anything more widely. And so perhaps there are more men that feel these symptoms but do not report it.
All right.
I think men deny it.
Men deny it. Okay.
I wasn't going to say that.
Okay.
So that's when the post-traumatic stress comes in, is that it will sometimes come up years later. So
Okay.
most veterans I worked with would absolutely deny that they have it.
All right. Jennifer, said something?
I don't know this statistically, but women may be more likely to be sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it actually turns out that men suffer more from being in war. Women suffer more from assaults, personal. So that's a understandable kind of difference. Yeah, it turns out that even incident for incident, so like in car crashes, the studies show that women are more likely to be traumatized than men. And the thinking is they're more likely to suffer from, generally, and this is across broad populations, anxiety, depression, other mental health problems. So it's when there's a load of stress. You talked about being a caregiver. If there's an extra load of stress, women tend to suffer more. So it is, I would have thought too, and there's some, lots of people think that men just don't talk about it. But it really turns out to be the case that women do suffer more.
Is there a racial difference too? We've recently learned about studies about African American people who are just depressed in general about the injustice, and so it seems.
I haven't seen anything. We're going to talk here in a few minutes about how the experience of trauma is such a unique experience. It wouldn't surprise me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that there would be racial disparity. But I don't know that to be the case. Yes?
I just had one comment to what you were saying, Sally, and I'm wondering if, even if the studies show that there is more depression, anxiety, stress, or whatever, I'm wondering if there is also information out there about people learning that that is the new normal. It's not new, but it's who I've been all my life, and so the things I learned and had to take on thicker skin about have been with me all that time. So there's a lot of depression there, but perhaps handling it has been a little different too. So maybe it tips over.
Kind of an overload. At a certain point, it does become, when you layer it on top of this and that, it becomes an overload at that point. Yeah.
But you're also saying there's more armor. You start with young, don't you?
Yes, I suppose so, but the armor starts to crack after a while. So,
So, in spite of how pervasive it is, it's really hard to talk about trauma. Nobody really likes to talk about it. Partly, I think, because it causes us to come face to face with the cruelty in the world. We have the natural world. We have earthquakes. We have hurricanes. We have all of that going on in the world. And then we also have sort of man's humanity to man. Inhumanity, I mean. that it's, we have to look at a lot of cruelty in the world when we look at some of the trauma. And it's, so I think that really does make it difficult to talk about it. But when we do talk about and think about trauma, there are an awful lot of societal considerations that we would need to think about. You probably all have your own considerations in your job as a mediator. So I'd be interested in hearing about that. But I'll just tell you some of the other considerations. For instance, one consideration, if we think about trauma and war, I mean, if we were to really think about what war does to people, many, many people, we might have to consider, are we really going to engage in this war? What are we really, because then we've got the aftermath to deal with. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is, when we think about trauma, economic justice, inequalities. Some of the hurricanes, for instance, you can see this. Katrina in New Orleans, 10 or 15 years, whenever that was. Just last year, I think it was Maria in Puerto Rico, and we're still hearing in the news about where the resources are devoted to. How do we allocate our resources? There's a lot of disparity between income levels in terms of how we decide who gets our resources, our money. Child protection, our foster care systems, our schools. How do we think about that in terms of traumatized children, for instance? Crime and punishment. We know that a high percentage, not all, but a high percentage of juvenile offenders have been traumatized, for instance. There was a study about 10 years ago of death row inmates, and in this study, it was a small study, but it naturally would be. But the death row inmates that were interviewed had pervasive, across the board, kind of endemic and varied forms of trauma, neglect, abuse, trauma in their backgrounds. It affected them at home, in the community, in their schools, and it just went on. So we know that trauma really does impact people. There are health costs too. Go ahead.
I wondered if you're going to get to talking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, ACE study.
I was not going to talk about that. Do you have a...
Well, I meant to bring charts and stuff. I forgot, but it's the same thing you're saying.
Yeah, it's...
The more traumas of neglect, abuse, etc. in childhood, the more likely you're going to have physical issues. You're going to end up being a perpetrator or a victim, either way.
Yeah. It's exactly from childhood experiences of neglect and abuse of a number of different forms. Healthcare costs, you just mentioned. Healthcare costs, we also know, are higher for people who've been traumatized. They have more physical ailments. It's just the way it is. Some of you, though, in your work, I said, may have your own thoughts and concerns about, as a mediator, about.
So I'll comment. So I work for the Dispute Resolution Center.
Okay.
So in my role, I'm in touch with any group, court, institution who wants to set up some kind of program. And over the years, these programs have become more and more complex. In part, the issues that they would bring to the table, but I think in the last 5 years or so, to me, in part, it's the person, him or herself, that comes to the table, whom we rely on all of you in this room to mediate the case or facilitate a circle, whatever you do. So my interest in this for me personally and for the center is, to Craig's point, I've been hearing more and more terminology around the adverse child experience, trauma, being trauma-informed, those kinds of buzzwords, and I thought, well, Belinda, you better understand and learn what that really means, and then start thinking about how it presents itself or may present itself in a case. Where do we draw a line? There's enough knowledge out there in this industry to talk about domestic violence, and if it's this happening, that case is not appropriate for mediation. They're beginning to think about it in other settings. When I say they, I mean the people in Lansing who make all the decisions. But I'm not sure if they, me, and my colleagues understand this enough. So that's, I think it was our child protection work that was the first inkling that we don't know enough. So the child, we know the child is traumatized, but I'm also learning that the parent may have been traumatized. They too have been a part of the foster care system. They had traumatic or adverse childhood experiences. A lot is packed in that person. Then something happens in the home, the kid is removed, so they become traumatized again. Then the court wants them to sort of fix the problems in a couple of sessions with us, or maybe even 6 sessions with us, and get their kids back. So one question I have, and I don't know if it's even appropriate, is how reasonable is that of a request? I feel very confident that we do a great job because of how we do our work. But I'm also needing I'm beginning to think there's not enough resources even for our part of this, because I worry often about that parent leaving the circle. They go to their hearing a week or so later. They actually get reunified with the kid, which I understand can also be somewhat traumatic when the kids come out of foster care and go back home.
Sure.
The court case may get closed in a short period of time, which means that the resources are cut off because the judges can order therapy and order this and order that. But once that file is closed, there are no more orders. So I don't know if I have a question or a comment, or if I made it more complicated, but it just feels like something is missing in our knowledge base. And I definitely understand the resources. Like I literally am begging people for money. Like, I love that you want us to come in as this third party neutral, but this is not enough, just based on my instincts. Like, this is not enough. Like, whoa, this is not enough. So that is one layer that you probably have something that you'll comment on that. And the other part of this is how does that impact us? You walk into these cases, the secondary trauma. So this is what I'm hearing at the schools, teachers at some of our more troubled schools. That child's traumatic life experience comes into the classroom, they flip off, and then I'm traumatized as a teacher. And I'm just wondering if mediators, if that's something that you might have felt in some of the cases that you've done. Is that even possible? Is that me overthinking, over-worrying? If the mediator loses it in a mediation or the circle, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know how do you recapture that? Because we rely on you all to be that steady, even-keeled voice. So is that something we should be thinking about? How do we know what is secondary trauma? How do I know if it's happening to me? What can I do to sort of kind of de-escalate, get my head back in the game?
So if I could just kind of, because I would kind of like to move into talking about that a bit, but I thought maybe if we could talk about just what you think trauma is, and because I really do want to address some of these very particular concerns that you have, as you're just now bringing up, because I'm not a mediator, and I have some ideas about that, and how overwhelming it can be. But I would like to have you if we could kind of move through talking about what trauma really is, and then what happens to a person when they're traumatized, and then talk about, well, what is secondary trauma? What does that mean? Can you be traumatized by listening to somebody? What does all that mean? That's okay? Okay. So if you could just talk, like in a 2 or 3 of you together, for maybe 5 minutes about what you think trauma really is. What does it mean to you? And then we'll talk about your ideas. So I'm curious to know what everybody kind of came up with. Can you talk a little bit about whether you think trauma is an event or an experience, or what did you decide amongst yourselves? Anybody?
What was that question, whether trauma is
an event or an experience?
For my understanding and what I shared, we didn't think we had to come to agreement. We just talked about everything. But total being overwhelmed and overwhelmingness that that freezes something that we are overwhelmed by in an emotional place, so that it continues to come back and haunt us. Whether what might overwhelm one person is different for what might overwhelm another person, and the more that you're able to take action at that time, the less trauma you may suffer, is my understanding.
Okay. So it's kind of the way you talked about it, at least now, it's an experience. It's a person's experience of being overwhelmed.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any ideas? Want to dovetail off of that?
I'll speak on behalf of my group, if that's okay. But so we talked about trauma being both an experience and an event. We talked about it from a professional standpoint and from a professional standpoint. From a personal standpoint, we said that trauma can come to a person through many different stages, shut them off from the world and create depression for them, make them feel like they want to maybe seek some help. So you can't really define it as being one thing to one person, because people deal with it differently. On a professional standpoint, we talked about trauma being something that happened, an event that happens that's a physical injury to a body, where the first responders and the dispatchers may feel the secondary trauma happening to them as well from that incident. Can I answer that one? So.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I think we could add to that. We didn't land on an idea of a definition, but we talked about how we might react to it, and it may be very delayed. So something might happen, but how we react or respond to it may not occur to that first happening until something else happens down the line. Mm-hmm. So, yes. So it's not necessarily a reaction at the moment.
Okay.
Is that fair? Right.
Go ahead.
I guess this brings up a really good question, because where is the line? What are the symptoms of the PTSD that you're talking about? And are there smaller traumas that just kind of, are triggered by some event that we react in an outsized, inappropriate way to?
I'll talk about the actual definition, description of PTSD in a few minutes. But you're right. Things can pile up, stress pile up. And it becomes at a certain point traumatic, whereas small little incidents might not have. The delayed response is an interesting point, because we now know, and that's actually written into the diagnostic manual of mental health diagnoses, that it's a very well known that trauma can appear later. We saw this really in Vietnam, is where we first noticed it, and I have talked to soldiers who came back from Vietnam, who got into their work. They were going to forget all about it. They were going to, leave this other stuff behind, narrow focus on work, and many years later suddenly developed a traumatic response reaction that caused hospitalizations, psychiatric hospitalizations. So we do know that can happen. Actually, I'm impressed by what you've said, because what you're talking about here is that trauma really is, it requires an event, except when there's just a pileup of the stress. But, so it requires an event, but it really is an individual's experience of the event that is what, how we understand trauma. There are objective parts to it and subjective parts. So the word trauma is intended in a psychological, in a physical way. Trauma, the word comes, it's a Greek derivative, and it's intended to convey events of great magnitude. So you have trauma hospitalization, surgery, facilities where they deal with trauma cases, gunshot wounds, those kinds of things, accidents. But in a psychological way, the word trauma is intended to be a word that captures events of great magnitude. We don't want to use it just for any kind of thing. That's not what it's intended for. So if we could just throw out some things that you think are clearly traumatic, we would think would be of a magnitude that would cause trauma. Anybody got?
Whenever a parent loses a child.
Death, okay.
Or
Death
the
of a
loss
child
of a
is traumatic.
parent.
I'm sorry?
Or the obverse, the loss of a parent.
Loss of a parent, all right.
Plane crash.
Plane crash, okay.
And especially any of those things that were said that happened suddenly, that you were not expecting.
Sudden,
Yeah, as opposed to a long
shocking,
illness.
shocking.
Right.
Yes, yes. So we have different categories of events. So we have single, impersonal kinds of events. So this is like a hurricane that comes through one time, an earthquake that, it's not personal. No person did it to us. That's one category of traumatic event. Another category is a single interpersonal event. This would be the death of a child. Shocking. That's a single event, typically, hopefully. A sexual assault, a one-time sexual assault, or any kind of assault. That's person to person, but it's a one-time event. And then we get into categories of prolonged repetitive events, ongoing adverse childhood experiences, for instance, repetitive war. We know that the more deployments a soldier has, the more likely they are to suffer from PTSD. The closer you are, the more you're exposed. That's a different category from a single event. And then we have something that people like to call complex trauma. It's called different sorts of names. Complex trauma, attachment trauma, children who are neglected. Really, parents are drug abusers. They're just left. Commonly results in traumatic response in the child, which then becomes an adult. Belinda, you mentioned the parents and children. We also know there is a lot of intergenerational transmission of trauma. How we parent children often is transmitted, the trauma is transmitted. And the children, just in the parenting style, it comes out.
So I have a question. So
Sure.
The separations of children at the border, the parent-children-child separation, that as I see it is the most traumatic experience a child could possibly suffer.
Okay, so that would be an event. And then the child's experience of that is what we're talking about in terms of whether there's a traumatic reaction. And we know, you heard my list of, in the beginning, not all, firefighters or assault victims, not everybody suffers a traumatic reaction. So it depends individually. I mean, I think being separated from a parent would, most of us can absolutely believe that's a traumatic event. But how does the child understand it?
Well, so I have a question related to that. So we're talking about, say, an individual being resilient, right, and not taking it that way.
Right.
But so much of resilience has to do with your surrounding support system. So say that this child who's separated at the border does go and stay with the loving aunt and grandma in New York. That's totally different than just being thrown into no support system.
Everything depends, exactly. It all depends in every case. There's no question about it. That the reaction of any individual depends on the membrane that surrounds that person's life. The children, absolutely.
One thing that I picked up on, at least, the definitions drive me nuts. Like, why do you want to define them either? Unless you're applying for some compensation for your PTSD. But one of the things I found more or less uniform is, did they go through it alone, or did they go through it as a group? So most often, at least in my experience, it's when a person experiences this by themselves or feels that they're by themselves rather than in a group.
Yeah,
If you're in a group, sometimes when that event happens, at least in my experience, is you all stand around and say, what the hell happened? And, what was that? And just the sharing of what did you see? How did you feel about that? But when you isolate a person and they're experiencing that themselves, there's no one to share it with. In fact, the person who's maybe traumatized doesn't believe it themselves. As one of our sayings in Nam was, ain't a big thing. Ain't a big thing. Go on.
Yep.
So.
Yep. You're absolutely right. There's no question about it. That imagine somebody who is attacked out on the street and goes home alone, doesn't have any friends, doesn't have anybody to talk to or process it. The experience of that person versus somebody who goes home to a family, is able to talk about it, think about it, get support, call people in who are going to help you do whatever needs to be done during those few days after such a sudden and violent attack. And think about the difference in terms of what that experience is going to be like to somebody. So,
I've had the experience in family where we'll get together years later and say, you remember when that happened? And your brothers and sisters and so on, I said, never happened. I never saw that. I mean, there's a lot of that going around. Recent events, too.
yeah.
Never saw it. Am I crazy? I swear I saw that.
Yeah.
So am I crazy?
But the question is, can we scientifically know what's going to cause somebody to suffer a traumatic reaction? No. We cannot know for sure, because it all depends on how that person experiences it, what that person's life has been like. So we want to be careful here. We named off some events, non-personal, personal, prolonged. The closer you are to death, the greater the likelihood is that you're going to suffer. Yeah, if
You don't
you
mean
come,
how old you are, you mean just how threatening the situation was.
yeah, I mean an event. Yeah, I don't mean no, age is not a criteria. Yeah. But if you're in a car crash and somebody died in that, and you very nearly died, you've got a greater reaction. I mean, a stronger reaction to that than if you watched it from a distance, for instance, or you were 2 cars back. I mean, that's just the way it works.
This brings up an odd question for me, but we didn't get television when I was young until I was pretty old. And we were told that what you watch on television could hurt you psychically.
Well,
but now I've watched stuff that that my parents wouldn't have liked on television, and actually I am shocked by it.
I think a lot of us are having some struggles watching TV, but
But I mean, that can't be traumatic, right?
you cannot be diagnosed with PTSD by watching something on TV. That
video games.
Well, it can cause all kind. I'm not arguing that it's good, any of this. I'm not arguing for that. But you can't formally be diagnosed by something from watching it across the screen. You have to have you have to be directly involved in it. I have often advised parents, though, to not let children watch some of the stuff that's on TV. I mean, it's just horrible.
So now this leads me to a question, because I thought I've heard dialogue about soldiers who are sitting in a control room and drop bombs on Benghazi, and the trauma that happens after that.
When they do drones, you mean?
Mm-hmm. And drop bombs.
Yeah, but I think they're directly involved in that. It's not like watching somebody from a distance. It doesn't make them not affected. But when it's just different when you're directly involved and when you're watching something on a screen that you don't have any direct involvement with.
You push the button.
Sure.
But they push the button in the video game.
So I did actually read an article from the maybe last year about that, about the drones and the effect that it has on people controlling them. And they do say that it affects some of these people. They're doing their patrols and they start to see the same people in the wherever it is, the market, or walking around the neighborhood each day, and then it comes a day where they have to click that button and drop a bomb. Maybe they don't know if the people that they saw yesterday that they know are friendly are nearby. So it definitely can affect them. It's much different than playing a video game where the person's going to come back to the game in 5 seconds, whereas that person, you're not sure what's going to.
Yeah.
So you can be traumatized by your action as well as actions done to you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Absolutely.
Or your failure to act.
Or your failure to act. We've learned a lot in wars about that. Not acting or acting. Go ahead.
So if I could ask, so does personal agency, if you're attacked or if something happens to you, having the ability to attempt to fight off, or so you have a plan, or is something where you feel that there are options? It is not just being done to you and you have to live with it, that's the end. Does that make a difference in terms of trauma reactions?
Yes, yes. So that victim I just, that we were imagining, an assault victim. So imagine the difference here again. I mean, goes home to support. But what about somebody who fights off an attacker, has a capacity to get away? It doesn't mean they're not going to be affected. I wouldn't argue that, but there's just, when you have a greater sense of agency, you mentioned that, it's helpful. We know from studies of children, the same thing with children. There's some studies done. One of them was by a researcher from the U of M who went to San Francisco. And this was back in 1976. There was a kidnapping of a bus of children out in the desert in California.
Yes.
Chowchilla. Yeah. And so the bus was kidnapped. The kids were driven 100 miles away and buried underground in the bus. And it was a horrendous incident. And they escaped 2 days later. The children managed to escape all by themselves. There were different ages of kids. And so this researcher happened to be out in California when these kids, and it was a few years later that some parent came in and said, please help me. Something has happened to my child and I don't know what it is. What they found was that the kids were all affected. That was unquestioned. But the ones who were in charge, who were able to make the escape plan, to do something, action is really helpful. And when you treat trauma in adults, because this is stuff in the body, it's our physical body that's affected. So, but the kids who could act, who could do something, were less damaged than the kids who just were paralyzed and couldn't do anything. So it's absolutely true that that action is helpful.
I think of the kids in school who are in homes where there's domestic violence, and they can't do anything, and then their feelings of not being able to do anything intensify that experience, that they're blamed for that hurt that was caused.
Yeah. When you cannot act, when you cannot do anything to escape, to get away from what's going on. I mean, little kids always try to escape from the domestic violence. They'll hide in their rooms, and some will get in their closets and they'll cover their ears and put the pillows over their heads and things like that. But really, they're pretty helpless in situations like that.
So I have a question about the situation. So in Iowa, there was, in the mid-'80s, there was the Great Farm Crisis. It was really in Iowa more than other states.
Okay.
And a lot of the farmers lost their farms. Many committed suicide. Many went on the skid row one way or another as a result of that trauma. However, a friend of mine has been doing a longitudinal study on this, and he just finished the report for 2015. And what he said, the remarkable thing about it was that some of the farmers, some of the families recovered and went on to make a better life for themselves.
Yes.
So what works there? Because the whole community was affected. You couldn't have that communal support. Well, I mean, you did, but you're all affected, so you're all committing suicide. I'm looking at Tom because, So, yes. So what was the mechanism there?
Okay. So there's a lot of possible responses to trauma. People have, some people, substance abusers. Substance abuse is a style of coping, but it's can be a response to trauma. Depression. Some people have more physical illnesses. PTSD, dissociative disorders. You may have heard that term thrown around. Disassociation tends to come the earlier the trauma, the more repetitive in your life. Child sexual abuse, for instance, is I'm thinking of one. What happens is that children check out in their minds. They just check out. And who wouldn't, when you think about it? And the earlier you do that in life, and the more you do it in life, the easier it is to do it later in life. So that it starts out as a protective kind of function that you just check out in your mind as a protection against what's happening to you. But later on, it becomes a disadvantage because you just check out. I mean, you could potentially see somebody in mediation who just kind of goes off somewhere. I see it sometimes in my practice once in a while. I just had a man the other day, and I knew he'd gone somewhere else when we were talking. I saw it. And I asked him, what just happened? And he came back to being present. But it could easily happen in mediation. Maybe a response to trauma. Probably is. On the other hand, all of us to a little extent disassociate. Have you ever had the experience of driving down the highway and you didn't realize that you'd just driven the last half an hour and didn't know you'd been driving the car?
And now you're out of state.
And hadn't been drinking, right? So we all do it to a certain extent, but in traumatic reactions, I mean, it's really pronounced. Borderline personality disorder is commonly, although not exclusively, the result of trauma. Borderline personality disorder is it's an emotional dysregulation, is what it really is. People.
I'm wondering about if there are any studies that talk about some kind of pre-training or pre-exposure before trauma occurs that would be helpful in the way individuals can deal with it if and when it comes up.
It's a great question, and people have thought about that, but nobody, to my knowledge, has come up with a way to inoculate somebody against it. We'd do it with our soldiers if we could.
I was thinking about it because, as you say, we don't want to throw trauma around too generally and whatnot, but certain things that talk about a person is going to experience stress when this, and that happens. And even some of the things that you think you wouldn't need to experience stress over, maybe a person moving a promotion, a demotion. Well, you could see with the demotion, but I think hearing things like that tend to help me deal more with, if I say, oh, this is a lot of stress, well, it's because I'm moving to a new place, or I've just gotten this promotion, or I'm going to do this, that, or the other, because I know, I've heard that those kinds of things might add to stress. So, I don't know, it seems to me like it helps me deal with it better, but maybe not.
I think that's what you're talking about there may be to do with stress, but also change, and how do we cope with change? So, and individually, how do we prepare ourselves for a promotion or something like that?
And kind of a piggyback off of that, you're talking about inoculation. I have a term I've been using, I heard old folks say it a long time, weak-minded, and I consider myself a strong-minded person who grew up in a dysfunctional family. I don't look at myself as dysfunctional, but I look at some of my other brothers and sisters. They appear to be dysfunctional, and I've seen enough of life. I've coined the term weak-minded because I don't seem to have been affected by all the dysfunctional things that I was a part of and grew up with, Matt, I'm not
Yeah.
going to be too long-winded, but is there a term, weak-minded? I mean,
Well, I think a lot of us remember hearing weak-minded. I heard about it, that term, when I was a kid from a grandparent or something like that. I don't necessarily view it as weak-minded. I think of it as everybody has their own experience.
okay.
And it depends on everything surrounding that person's life. So I don't really think of it as weak-minded,
Okay.
but it's everybody's individual experience.
Well,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Isn't it just an interpretation, a personal interpretation?
Yeah.
of an
It's just
experience?
exactly, yeah.
But it's also how much resilience you have.
Yeah, some people are much more resilient than others.
By a lot of different things. Just your temperament, who's around you, who's supporting you.
Yeah.
What rank you have in family.
Let me talk just a little bit about what PTSD actually is, because I know we're kind of getting short on time, and I want to kind of get back here to the issue that Belinda brought up first. But PTSD, a formal diagnosis, requires actual exposure to death or threatened death. You must be exposed to it. So people can have all kinds of traumatic reactions, but it's not going to be PTSD unless they were. Now, if you're in a home where there's a lot of domestic violence, maybe you're not subject to that, but you certainly are exposed to it. Somebody's getting hurt. You can be diagnosed with PTSD that way, but not, as I say, by watching it across.
Why is that important? Why is that diagnosis important? That they must have experienced the following things. Otherwise, it's not PTSD.
It is not necessarily important, but a lot of people, the term PTSD is thrown around. I'm just telling you it's just bandied about. You may have all kinds of traumatic experiences but it's not PTSD itself. I just want to make a couple
that
points.
sounds like the Veterans Administration form.
It's psychiatrist is what it is. People with PTSD will have intrusive symptoms. So you will see flashbacks. You'll hear people talking. They'll have nightmares. All kinds of things go on that it's intrusive. It comes in. They'll just flashback. You will have.
Can you describe a flashback? And I assume that it's different than a dream, but
It is. It's taking yourself back in an instant like this. You may have a smell. You may catch a scent in the air that suddenly it's as if you are in the middle of that battlefield right now. People drop down. They think they're going to be fired at. Literally, it's not there's no conscious awareness that something is unusual right now. It's as if it is actually happening. That's a flashback.
Can I give an example? For around the 4th of July and sometimes around Memorial Day when people are doing fireworks. Oftentimes for some soldiers who struggle with PTSD, that actually really takes them back to being on the battlefield. I actually have a neighbor that lives 3 doors down from me, and he struggles. He did 2 stints in World War II, and he struggles with PTSD, and around that time he actually has his house, his windows and doors, so that he can try and drown out the sounds around the 4th of July, Memorial Day, because it really actually takes him back to being on the battlefield.
Yeah. I was just talking to somebody the other day.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No.
interject,
I'm glad. A patient of mine, his brother, he was talking about an incident 4th of July. They were at some fireworks, and the brother just flew out of there because he thought he was kind of back on that battlefield. And it's not. You can't control it. You can't control it.
It's not a choice.
It is not a choice.
You're hijacked. I have
Yeah.
a friend, she was very badly abused, and both of her parents, but they were smokers. And if she smells cigarette smoke, she becomes catatonic
Mm-hmm.
because she's back.
Yeah. Yeah, you actually go back. You can't. Trauma affects the earlier part of our brain. It actually, we are flooded. When traumatized, we are totally flooded with chemicals in this, in certain parts of our brain. The thinking brain can't come in to bear. When you're talking about your mediation, people can't think their way through it. If they really are having a traumatic response to something, they're not going to think their way through this because their thinking brain isn't operating right now. It's their emotional brain.
And I think people can get triggered by something that's not traumatic. But someone said when you're triggered, you lose your mind. And I thought that's kind of interesting.
It's kind of, yeah, you lose
and
your...
Trauma's even deeper than that.
Yeah.
So as a mediator, do you think when something like that happens and you can see it happening, you ask to take this up again another day?
Yeah, what do you do? What's your response as a mediator?
If I may. I mean, when you see, and you should see it, that somebody has not been able, like you say, to tune out, right? When somebody can't be part of it, you have to stop. You have to see if something can be done for them, and if it can't be done for them, it's just time to call it quits, because you can't be a therapist, you're just being a mediator.
Right. And working with somebody who's been traumatized really takes a very long time. I don't think 2 sessions with a mediator is going to resolve anything. It's just not possible. People who've been traumatized, this takes work and rework and working it all over again and then coming back again to it. It can't happen because this is a flooding of the body, and it's just. But I would think you would have to take a break. You might, if somebody seems to be able, depending on their level of resilience or something, or their how they've worked it through at this point, you might be able to kind of individually say, it seems like something else is going on here. It very gently, depending on the situation, seems like something else is going on here. Am I right about that? But I would think breaks. But I don't think you could help somebody work through traumatic events in.
And it might not be the traumatic event that's presenting itself. So the question is whether or not they can get back enough to deal with the situation that you're dealing with.
And beyond the idea of trauma, we all, in every situation, particularly novel situations, we kind of scan our brains and figure out what we think that person's going to be like. In my field, we call it transference. We transfer feelings that we had for important people in our past, primarily early childhood, onto other people. And so people who walk into a mediation, not only are they already emotionally involved in something with the other party, but they have expectations of you as a mediator, how it's going to be, based on what their early life has been. And so you may be looking at somebody or talking to somebody, it's not just a trauma in their background. I mean, we don't know. I mean, given how pervasive trauma is, you can, it might be the safest to just assume it's trauma, but we don't know. But it could be just a difficult experience with people early in their life. And somebody just reminds them of that person. They're not even aware of it. And I don't necessarily know there's anything you can do in mediation about that problem either.
I don't know, I've never thought of trying it in mediation, but sort of part of the circle process that we do in peacemaking circles, just the basic idea of mindfulness. What you want is people to be present, not thinking about, or unconsciously or whatever, past trauma or past associations. You want them to be present, mindful, and So taking a break is one thing, but if they're in the circle process, we start off with this sort of creating this sacred, safe space, taking a few breaths, reading something to get people in a better frame of mind, get them present and open, willing to talk. And that, depending on what kind of stuff they're dealing with, that can help sort of decrease the tension, whatever, any smaller triggers that might be present for them, to get them present with whoever else is in the room, feel better.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like good practice to me, just kind of across the board. You know, we talk about kind of universal kind of practices, and that sounds like something to make people comfortable and kind of settled when they first come in to the best of your ability. Sounds like a best practice to me.
I think one of the things, I guess, it's hard is if you see somebody and you think there might be a trauma or some reason that they aren't able to fully participate, and you've caucused and then you close it, it's going to go to court. And so you end up, do you know what I mean? You almost feel like the train is just going to keep on rolling, and that person's going to go to court, and it's not going to get better there. You know?
I'm sure.
So that becomes, I guess, the issue of our secondary trauma or whatever, how we feel about the cases, and then there's confidentiality agreements, so you can't go home and talk it out. You know what I mean? So you're kind of left chewing on that in your own head, but it doesn't feel good.
No, and you do kind of need some. You do kind of need some support in that kind of stuff, even if you can't. But I mean, amongst yourselves, or I mean.
And if you change enough of the facts, you can talk about it as well.
Yeah.
Maybe make a man instead of a woman.
In my field, it's really important. Most therapists that I know who are good therapists really get supervision, and we do consultation. What's going on? I mean, everything is, all the identities are changed, and all the circumstances, but to help. So you really do have to provide that for each other. I want to say something about the cases that go to court. I don't know if you do high conflict divorces. I mean, I'm not sure. So those are particular kinds of situations, and I have a colleague who's done a lot of work in this area. He even wrote a book about 3 years ago. His name is Joshua Ehrlich, and he the thinking is now that high conflict divorces is really, it's not necessarily related to trauma. It might be, but what it is people are unable to separate, to mourn the loss. There's so much grief that is going on between the parties, and that they absolutely cannot face it, and so they stay connected forever in some cases I've heard of by fighting. That's what they get out of it. It's not a traumatic reaction, maybe, but really what they're avoiding is the pain that is completely intolerable to them of the separation. So they can stay, and you may see that, the courts see it, people go on for 20 years, really locked in this because they cannot leave the other person. It's a difficult problem.
So, Pamela, thank you so much. I just noticed we don't have a clock in here,
Yeah.
so it's kind of hard to know what time it is, but it's getting to be 1 o'clock. Is there one last thing you want to tell us?
How about some signs of trauma?
Signs?
Some signs.
People who are traumatized have cognition problems, like, they change their way of viewing the world. So they may, seem, how they view themselves, how they view other people in the world. Is the world a safe place? There are memory problems. So police detectives, good police officers understand this now. When people come in, and oftentimes the memory of the event, what they just experienced, hugely like an assault, they don't tell a story like 1, 2, 3. You know, this is the chronology of the story, this is what happened to me. They may focus on one aspect of the incident. Somebody's smell, or a certain, you know, I don't know, a mole on their hand or something like that. And so you may see people who really can't tell the story chronologically at all. And so police officers have to just allow the person to tell what they saw or felt or heard, and then later on maybe get to the other stuff that may come out as a result of those few details that they have in the beginning. Those are two big signs of trauma.
That's about the event. The event is shattered, but their whole memory is not shattered as far
Correct.
as anything, as far as everything else is
You know, it's
concerned.
an interesting thing. Another thing about memory is there was a study a while back, a long time ago, a longitudinal study of Harvard graduates. And so they interviewed the graduates, and then every 5 years they interviewed them over a period of decades, I think. And what they discovered is that people who've been traumatized, the memory kind of freezes in their mind. Most of us, if you think about your memory, you will notice that our memories kind of evolve and change over time. We may think about an event in a certain way. We may focus on one thing in one way instead of another way. People who've been traumatized, really that memory kind of freezes in their mind. Whatever it is that they remember, it just sort of freezes there. So what you want in therapy, what you hope, is that people have some growth beyond that, so that people can leave it in the past. It is a memory. It happened back there. It is not still ongoing. But, I mean, really think about your memories. Sometimes you'll see if you think about it, maybe you see a photograph of yourself as a child, and you don't know if you actually remember that event, or was it your mother telling you a story, or your father telling you a story about that event that you really remember. So memory is it's a funny thing. When you develop beyond it, your memories do tend to change.
I once heard of a man who described being held up in a bank, and he was asked to describe the person who had the gun pointed right at him, saying, "I'm going to shoot if you don't."
Mm-hmm. Right.
And he described a certain person, and then he gave that description to the police. And when he was shown the video, the descriptions didn't match at all.
Right.
So I'm having trouble.
Witness unreliability, exactly.
Putting.
We remember. You know, I mean, memory is not. If we now know about courts and juries, and eyewitness accounts are really notoriously unreliable. I mean, we're having people who are getting exonerated of crimes because they may have been convicted on the basis of eyewitness accounts, and they're unreliable. We have a lot of stuff going on in our head when if we got a gun pointed in front of us, we got chemicals happening, we got all kinds of stuff. And so our memories are very unreliable for certain things.
Pamela, thank you so much.